So welcome everyone to the Conflict, Security and Development series. And we give thanks to our co-sponsors, which is CGA, NYU School of Professional Studies, the Program on International Relations, NYU's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Robert L. Bernstein Institute of Human Rights, and also the International Education Program at NYU Steinhardt and the Office of International Programs at NYU Wagner. I have today, it is my pleasure to introduce George Reddings, who is the Director of Global Crisis Analysis at IRC. And he leads a team that provides forward-looking analysis on the drivers and impacts of humanitarian crisis globally. And he's here to tell us a bit about the 2024 IRC Emergency Watchlist. And for over a decade now, the IRC has released its annual emergency watch list, highlighting the top 20 countries at risk and of the new and worsening humanitarian crises at this time. George joined IRC in the late 2015 as part of the organization's Middle East team, and he's moved on to the global role in 2018. The CGA team leads the delivery of the IRC annual watch list, and right now we're watching a great number of countries unfold in terms of the greatest risks of deterioration in humanitarian situations. And so he joined IRC from the private sector, where several years ago he had been providing political and security risk analysis to corporate clients at this time. And before that, he worked at a London think tank. He has a BA in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and spent a year learning Arabic at the University of Damascus. His interests include reading novels of Graham Greene and walking his two dogs. So over to you, George. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Patty, for that comprehensive introduction. And it's great to be with you here today and to see so much interest in the watch list and in the IRC. As Patty mentioned, my name is George Reddings. I'm the Director of Global Crisis Analysis at the IRC. And I lead a small team, exactly as Patty was saying, doing forward-looking analysis to help the IRC understand how and why crises are evolving. And we're not just doing this purely because it's sort of academically interesting or important. The key purpose is that this analysis has to be relevant and useful for the IRC as we engage in our mission to support crisis-affected communities. So our sort of grounding assumption is that if we can better understand how and why crises are evolving, looking at the politics, the conflict, the economics, the climate trends that are driving them, then we will be able to respond more effectively to better serve crisis-affected communities. On the watch list, my main responsibility is to the analysis and the drafting. So whilst I'm very happy to be here today representing the watch list and the IRC, I can't emphasize enough just how much of a collective effort the report is in terms of the analysis, in terms of the wider effort to design and launch it publicly. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to share some insights from this year's emergency watch list to try and address three questions. That's to say, why are we seeing such extreme levels of humanitarian crisis in the world? Why isn't the international community responding more effectively to humanitarian crisis? And lastly, but most importantly, what can be done to reduce the impact of these crises on our affected communities? But before that, I'd like to just add a little bit more on what the watch list is. So next slide, please. At its core, the emergency watch list is a list of 20 countries that the IRC believes are at greatest risk of new or worsened humanitarian emergency over the coming year. So the specific exam question we're addressing is about the deterioration over the course of 2024, not necessarily about which emergency was the most severe at the point when we released the report in December 2023. We think about deterioration both in terms of scale of crisis and severity of the crisis and its impacts. So this year, you'll see that Sudan tops the list, followed by the Occupied Palestinian Territory, OPT, and South Sudan. It's the incredible severity of what is happening in Gaza that pushes OPT to its highest ever ranking on the watch list. But it's the combination of both severity and scale in Sudan and the expectation that both are going to continue to get considerably worse throughout the course of 2024 that pushes Sudan to the top of the list this year. Given the intense urban conflict in and around Khartoum, the brutal violence playing out often along ethnic lines in the Darfur region, and the fact that both violence and humanitarian needs are spreading across the country. You may have seen the predictions this week of massive catastrophic food insecurity later this year in Sudan. We have produced a watch list for well over a decade now. We're not entirely sure when the first one was. We think it was probably 2008, but it is lost in someone's hard drive. Originally, its sole purpose was to help us cut through the noise surrounding crises and media reporting of them, to ensure that we were using our limited resources that we have available for emergency preparedness, making sure we're using those resources as effectively as possible by focusing those efforts where they would most be needed, where there was the greatest risk of new or worsened humanitarian emergency over the coming year. So yeah, initially it was a purely internal report, and it was successful for us in focusing our efforts. Each year, it predicts around 85 to 95% of the 20 countries that subsequently saw the worst deteriorations over the following year. But pretty early on, we realized that it wasn't enough just to have this list internally. We wanted to share it externally to ensure that other organizations and those with power should also be focusing on those countries, not just us at the IRC. We also came to the view more recently over the last 3 or 4 years that just sharing a list of 20 countries isn't enough. We have also started to include in the watch list our explanation, our understanding of how and why global humanitarian crises are evolving, and most importantly, so what can be done to reduce the impact on affected communities. So on the first slide, you will have seen the tagline of this year's report, "No myths, just facts." This is not just a snappy tagline developed by my comms colleagues, but it really is the encapsulation of the argument we're making in this year's report. But before I say any more on that subject, I'd just like to share a short video that helps explain it a little more. Thank you.
If you want to understand what's driving humanitarian crises, you need to understand the IRC's Emergency Watchlist. Each year it reveals 20 countries facing new and worsening emergencies and how we cut through the myths to get to solutions. When you read the Emergency Watchlist, you'll see that when governments can't meet citizens' needs, armed groups can form, and how this triggers new conflicts and intensifies old ones. And if global or regional powers intervene, things can get worse, not better. You'll understand that conflict destroys the systems people need, like healthcare and food production, and this impact is felt today and for generations. The myth is we can fix the problem by just delivering supplies, like food and medicine. The fact is, if we deliver flour to a war-affected community, but conflict and drought have left them without water to make bread, we haven't done enough. People need ongoing access to services to care for their families. Now that you know these facts about conflict, you need to know this about climate change. Climate change makes the devastation of conflict even worse. When violence and extreme weather converge, even more people go hungry and lose their homes and livelihoods. And it's a myth that by cutting emissions, we can avoid the climate crisis. The climate crisis is here, now, and we need to help people in conflict zones adapt. When you understand these facts, you can ignore the myths. And when you read the Emergency Watchlist, you'll see how, together, we can get to real and lasting solutions. Read the 2024 Emergency Watchlist at rescue.org.
Thank you. So before I get onto the 3 questions I outlined at the top, I just want to share a little bit more on how we actually identify the top 20 countries on the watch list. So the country selection process, and not just identifying which countries to include on the list, but where to rank them, starts with an analytically rigorous process we've developed over several years now, where we deploy 65 different quantitative and qualitative variables, which all speak to either the risk of a new shock occurring, whether that's a natural shock, a conflict one, economic disease outbreak, or something else, and the expected impact should such a shock occur. And we look at that expected impact in a couple of ways, looking at both the existing pressures on the population and the country's readiness to respond to new shocks. So an example that I like to share here is one of Japan, which when we look on the indicators that speak to the risk of a natural shock occurring, it clearly ranks extremely highly. But then when we look at the existing pressures on the population, which are much lower, and the country's existing capacity to respond much higher, it becomes very easy for us to make the decision not to include Japan on the watch list, despite the very real natural risks that it continues to face. We then bring that global level analysis and from the data together with more qualitative insights from IRC colleagues who are working in more than 50 countries around the world, and they share with us what they're seeing, the risks they foresee for the year ahead, and share insights that we would have missed otherwise. And every year we look at the performance of our watch list. I mentioned it predicts about 85 to 95% of major deteriorations. One of the key step improvements in the accuracy of our predictions was the year where we started to much more formally engage colleagues across the IRC to get their insight and to layer that on top of the data analysis. And that has really helped to improve the analytical quality of the report. This year and last year, we also held what we call roundtable events in each region. So these are moments when we bring together not just IRC staff, but experts from those regions, whether leaders of community-based organizations or from local think tanks and academic institutions. And we have discussions with them under the Chatham House rule, enabling a very free and open conversation, again, where they speak to their concerns, their risks, and their insights for their region and more globally, the watch list. This is obviously just a very brief overview of the methodology. It's described in much more detail in the report. And we always share full technical notes as well. That's linked to from the methodology annex of the report. And that technical notes lists out every single one of the data sources that we use. So if you have questions about the precise indicators we use in the watch list, the technical notes are always the best place to start and to look. But before getting into the main part of this presentation, I wanted to share a personal reflection. This is the 6th watch list I have worked on for the IRC. And in many ways, analytically, professionally, personally, it has been the hardest. And a lot of that has to do with events developing in the world since we started working on this list in September 2023. We already knew that the Occupied Palestinian Territory, OPT, needed to be on the list, but the conflict in Gaza escalated very significantly at the start of October, as we're all more than aware. Then later in October, there was a realignment of armed groups in Myanmar, which shifted the course of the conflict there, fundamentally shifting our analysis of the risks facing the countries. So these developments meant we had to delay finalizing the list beyond the planned date, so we could reevaluate the situation. We made changes in bringing up the rankings of both OPT and Myanmar. And as we did that, we then had to make the near impossible decisions about which countries to move down the list. Because one of the things we struggle with each year and challenges we face is just because a country is moving down the rankings doesn't mean the situation there is actually improving. In fact, in many cases, the countries that are staying low on the list or moving down the list are seeing just as severe crises now as they were a while ago, but the other crises happening in other countries are getting that much worse, and that is forcing us to move them, relatively speaking, down the rankings. Anyway, now you have had this little glimpse behind the curtain of the watch list. Let me return to those questions I said I'd try to address at the start. So next slide, please. I want to start with one simple but rather bleak fact. For many of the people that the IRC serves, these are the worst of times. the figures are absolutely stark. In 2023, there were over 300 million people in humanitarian need. That was 14 times the number a decade earlier. So being in humanitarian need means that they've been identified in a coordinated humanitarian response plan by the UN as being in need of some kind of humanitarian or protection assistance to support themselves and their family to live through the crisis. There are currently 110 million people who are forcibly displaced in the world. That means they've been forced to flee their homes to find safety. The majority of forcibly displaced people remain somewhere within their country of origin, but some have also crossed international borders to find safety. 110 million people forcibly displaced is the highest number of people forcibly displaced since records began shortly after World War II. There are also 240 million people who are experiencing crisis or worse levels of food insecurity. Now, NGOs and the humanitarian sector are awful for jargon, and I appreciate not everybody here is in the humanitarian sector. So crisis here is a technical term relating to the 1 to 5 IPC scale, where 5 is catastrophic food insecurity, where people are dying every day of starvation. At crisis, which is 3 on the scale, people are being forced to make impossible decisions to feed their families. They're skipping meals, putting their children out of school to work, or effectively mortgaging their futures to buy food today by selling off the assets like cattle on which their future well-being will depend. And at the IRC, we never lose sight of the fact that these shocking statistics are not just numbers. They represent individuals, families living through these crises. Next slide, please. So these numbers can and do feel overwhelming at times, and it's difficult to know where to start to understand what's going on. And this is where the watchlist countries and the watchlist can be helpful. So these 20 countries represent about 10% of the world's population, but they account for 86% of all people in humanitarian need globally. So that's to say people who are in need in countries on the watchlist, or who are in need having become a refugee elsewhere, having fled those countries. So 86% of all people in humanitarian need are accounted for by these 20 countries. 75% of people who are forcibly displaced from these countries, and nearly 70% of those experiencing this crisis or worse levels of food insecurity, IPC 3 or higher levels of food insecurity. And also they represent a growing share of global extreme poverty. This disproportionate focus of humanitarian crisis in these 20 countries and the growing focus of extreme poverty within them allows us to use these countries as a lens to understand what is happening at the global level. And there is a lot we could dig into here. The watch list this year sets out 8 facts that we say help to explain the extreme levels of humanitarian crisis we are seeing in the world at the moment. I'm going to just talk about one of those now, which is that there's a growing overlap between countries that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and those that are experiencing armed conflict. So if we go to the next slide, you should see a map. Thank you. And what this map shows is the extensive overlap between countries that are experiencing armed conflict, according to the World Bank. And the World Bank uses data from ACLED and UCDP, Uppsala Conflict Data Program, to make their judgments about conflict affected. And the conflict according to the World Bank, and then those countries that are least prepared to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis, as defined by the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, or NDGAIN. It then lays on top of armed conflict and climate vulnerability, which are the countries that are on the watch list, and those are the ones shaded with the diagonal lines. It goes almost without saying, but I think it's worth emphasizing anyway, that the countries on the watch list are not the ones responsible for the climate crisis. Watch list countries contribute less than 2% of global carbon emissions, but they are facing a disproportionate burden in the climate crisis. And this year, one of the things that we're concerned about is the way in which the El Nino effect is in operation currently, and that's set to worsen some of those climate impacts. What you see on this map, and what stood out to me when my colleague Naomi first put this together, is that of the 16 countries that are both conflict affected and climate vulnerable, 14 are on this year's watch list. The other two countries, Cameroon and Mozambique, that are both conflict affected and climate vulnerable, but not on the watch list, have been on and off the watch list for several years now. If you look back at past editions on our website, you'll see them coming on and off the watch list. The crisis analysis team, we went back through the last few decades of data about climate vulnerability and about armed conflict. And what we found is that the overlap between climate and conflict is growing. And this is primarily because of an increase in the number of conflicts that are happening in climate vulnerable countries. So the percentage of countries that are happening in climate vulnerable countries, 3 decades ago, that was 44% of conflicts were in climate vulnerable countries. As of the most recent data, which I think is 21 or 22, 67% of conflicts are now happening in climate vulnerable countries. This trend, as this map illustrates, is most pronounced on the continent of Africa. When we look at the continent as a whole, you see many countries achieving fast growth and rising living standards. But 8 of the top 10 countries on the watch list are in Africa. And every single one of those is both conflict affected and climate vulnerable. 12 of the 16 climate vulnerable conflict affected states are in Africa. So what is happening that causes armed conflict and vulnerability to the climate crisis to converge in these countries and together to drive humanitarian crisis? One interpretation could be that the climate crisis is leading to reduced availability of resources that then leads to greater competition over those resources and in turn conflict. And this is clearly part of what is going on in some watchlist countries. But I don't think it's a sufficient explanation. It certainly doesn't account for the conflict we see at the top of the watch list in Sudan, where you have 2 rival branches of the Sudanese security forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, that are fighting ultimately for control of the Sudanese state. So when we look at the data and when we reflect on what we heard in the regional roundtables that we held during the process, they all point, particularly in the continent of Africa, towards the underlying role of weak governance. And when you look at these countries and the governance indicators that we use for the watch list process, they all score disproportionately lower when compared to continental or global averages. That the question of governance is clearly a huge one, and I don't intend to cover it fully here by any measure. But I think it's important when we look at these countries to have a view to the historical context. And first, just the starting point here is to look back to the damage done to existing societies and systems by the long histories of colonial rule, which are shared by nearly all of the African and non-African countries on the watch list. Then, as we sort of move forward, you look at the way in which the post-colonial governments continued highly centralized and extractive ways of working that often left some of the more peripheral areas underdeveloped. Then, as we look forward to the present day, we see a few things. We see high levels of dissatisfaction with central governments. We see violent and unconstitutional transitions of power. There's been a lot of discussion about the increasing prevalence of coups or return of coups. Of the top 10 countries, 5 of them have had a violent or unconstitutional transition of power within the last few years. And 4 of those are countries in Africa. Of the 11 African watchlist countries on the list this year, nearly half, 5, have had coups or unconstitutional transitions of power in the last few years. So Chad is not in the top 10, but is the other country in Africa that has had that kind of shift in power. We also see the spread of non-state armed groups. So looking again just at the African watchlist countries, in the period between 2010 and 2022, we saw a 155% increase in the number of armed groups operating in those countries. We also see economies that are highly reliant on climate vulnerable sectors and debt. And together, these factors come together to increase the risk of conflict. They also make it less likely that the countries will be ready and prepared to respond to the climate crisis, or indeed to the impact of economic shocks. But Questions of weak governance are certainly not new, and while the overlap of the climate crisis and armed conflict is growing, that also is not new. So while this and the other facts that we describe in the report help us to understand the extreme levels of need we're seeing in the world, they lead us on directly to my second question, because if these issues are not new, if the crises in most cases are not new, why aren't we responding more effectively to mitigate the impact on affected communities? So our starting point is that many of the countries on the watch list this year were on the watch list last year and the year before that. Often they rise up because crises have entered dangerous new phases, as in Sudan and the occupied Palestinian territory. Of the 20 countries on this year's watch list, only Ecuador had never appeared on the watch list previously. 18 of the countries on this year's watch list were on it last year. Given this reality, the world should be better and more effective at responding to these crises. And yet, if we use just climate change as an example, we see the world as a whole, because of global averages, we see vulnerability to the impact of the climate crisis slowly, but it is slowly reducing. If you look only at the 20 watch list countries, they're going backwards. They're becoming more vulnerable to the going backwards in terms of their readiness to respond to the climate crisis. The number of climate shocks is growing globally, but it's rising much faster in watch list countries, where climate shocks have increased over 350% since 1980, than in the rest of the world, where it's up 220%. We also see the number of people affected by natural hazards, which includes some non-climate shocks as well. That has increased 16-fold in watch list countries between 1995 and 2021, but it's decreased 66% in the rest of the world. Just as a side note, you'll notice that not all of these statistics are comparing the exact same periods. This is one of the challenges we have with the watch list, is just the data availability and particularly finding data that speaks to the kinds of issues that we want to dig into. It can be hard to find, so we make the best sort of comparisons as we can, but we can't always get the most like-for-like comparisons between different data points. So that's why we've got the rise in climate shocks between 1980 and today versus the rise in natural hazards, the number of people affected between 1995 and 2021. Anyway, at the same time that we're seeing this sort of increasing impact of the climate crisis in watch list countries, we find that when we're talking to donors and multilateral institutions, development banks, those that have a particular ability to work at scale with countries that are experiencing the climate crisis, we often find that they are doing less or working less effectively in the countries and areas of countries where the climate crisis is being felt particularly intensely because of the overlap with armed conflict. Even though the work of our partners on the ground, of our teams on the ground, shows that it is very possible to engage in effective climate action in countries on the watch list. So what is going on? Our argument that we lay out in the report is that there are 5 myths that have taken hold of public media political discourse about humanitarian crises. And these myths are obscuring the real and proven solutions that we know could work to reduce the impact of these crises. So, next slide, please. In the video at the start, you heard a line about climate mitigation, about how reducing carbon dioxide production is not enough. So clearly, we think that reducing carbon dioxide production is vital and important. We think it's critical to keep temperature change down. But the communities we serve in watch list countries are already living through the climate crisis. As the video says, it is here now. The fact is, even if the world achieves its most ambitious goals of curbing global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, of getting emissions down to net zero, people in watch list countries will still have to live with the current climate crisis, actually a slightly worsened version of it, particularly more frequent flooding and more frequent droughts. There are steps that can be taken to help communities to adapt to those risks, to live with more frequent flooding, to live with more frequent droughts. But this myth means that inadequate resources are being invested in supporting countries like those on the watch list to make those adaptations to the climate change. Next slide, please. Another myth mentioned in the video is the idea that humanitarian access can be measured in truckloads of supplies delivered alone. I just want to clarify a point about this, because if you look at the IRC's website, you will see a number of press releases where we highlight that there are 0 trucks entering a specific area. I think the absence of trucks being on the move can often be quite a good indicator that humanitarian access is not possible. But humanitarian access is the ability of crisis-affected communities to access the services they require to survive, recover, and rebuild their lives. And it's two-sided. So the first side is about the ability of crisis-affected communities to access these services. The second side of it is the ability of organizations like the IRC to reach those communities to deliver services. When reporting focuses purely on the number of trucks on the move, not what they are delivering or the feasibility of effective humanitarian action at the other end, it becomes harder to make the case for meaningful access. We've seen too many examples in recent years where a party to a conflict has cut off a community as a way to gain a military or political advantage, starving the population. We then rightly see international outrage growing as evidence of the impact of the siege grows. And the result is that there's increasing pressure on the party to the conflict to stop blocking access. However, what we then see is the party saying, okay, we'll let 10, 15, 20 trucks cross the front line. Perhaps they'll describe this as part of a quote-unquote humanitarian corridor. The diplomats who negotiated the deal celebrate a success, and it gets written up as such. But is it really a success, or was it just a pressure release valve for the party that was blocking the access? What the video alludes to is that there have been cases where children are starving to death due to a siege, and the actor whose forces are besieging the population then agrees to allow food in on trucks. But what we then see is that at the last checkpoint, the besieging forces remove the plumpy nut, the therapeutic food that we use to treat acute malnutrition in children. And while the trucks are allowed to deliver packages of flour, the town is still cut off from the fuel and water that residents would need to turn it into bread to eat. So whilst trucks have moved, whilst quote unquote food has been delivered, nothing really has changed for the affected population. So while we know that achieving humanitarian access can and does save lives, when attention focuses only on the number of trucks on the move, it obscures what is needed to achieve meaningful humanitarian access that would actually have a real impact for affected communities. Next slide, please. What we see too often in humanitarian responses is that the question of gender equality is seen as a lower priority. It's a nice to have rather than something that is essential to an effective humanitarian response, particularly one that meets the needs of women and girls. But this is critical for a number of reasons. The reality is that gender inequality is life-threatening for women and girls. There were 150 million more hungry women than men in 2021. Likewise, the UN Environment Programme estimates that around 80% of people displaced by climate change are women and girls. So humanitarian crises have a different, often disproportionate impact on women and girls that too often is ignored. We also see that programs targeting the needs of women and girls are still deprioritized as they're not considered quote unquote life-saving. So for the countries that are experiencing humanitarian crises, many have a coordinated humanitarian response plan. And when we look across those plans globally to see how much funding there is available for different sectors like health or education, we see that despite the fact that gender-based violence affects around 20 to 30% of women in conflict settings, and in some up to 70%, we see that despite that, programming that addresses gender-based violence is the least funded sector across all coordinated humanitarian response plans. So just 13% of the funding that is needed to pay for programming to address gender-based violence is received on average, less than half of the average for all other sectors. Ultimately, if a response aims to save lives, but doesn't incorporate feminist approaches to respond to the gendered impacts of the crisis, then that response is doomed to fail. Next slide, please. I just want to pause at this point to acknowledge that this has been a pretty bleak presentation so far, and the watch list is in many ways a really difficult read. I wanted to share a couple of things that give me a level of hope, though, because defeatism is certainly the last thing we need. The first thing that gives me hope is knowing the impact of the programs implemented by the IRC and our partners in every single one of the countries on the watch list. I've had the privilege of traveling with the IRC to many of the countries on the watch list and to see how these services make a real difference in people's lives. So that's a key thing for me. We're not just producing this list and sharing this bleak analysis for the sake of it. We're doing it as part of our effort to respond to those crises and make a difference there. The second returns more to the watch list itself. The fact that there are so many people in need and forcibly displaced in the world can make these challenges seem and feel insurmountable. I certainly have that feeling at times myself. They are frankly incredible, unimaginable numbers of people in need at the moment. But when we remember that these needs are disproportionately focused in the 20 watch list countries, that gives us a place to start. And if we can bust those myths, there are a set of real and proven solutions that we describe in the report that can work for watch list countries and thus start to put a dent in the scale of global crisis. The watch list report sets out 6 priorities for action to address the unprecedented global challenges. I'm going to skip through a few of these at a higher level and then focus on the last in most detail, but they are all described fully in the report itself. So if you haven't yet, please do have a read. Under the first point on the list, to save lives in fragile and conflict-affected states by investing in climate adaptation, resilience, and anticipatory action. One really important step forward would be for more money to be invested in supporting countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We set a specific target in the report that 50% of all public finance should be invested in adaptation. But it's not enough just to have more money. There need to be ways to make that money work for communities in conflict-affected countries, whose governments may not have the intent or capability to partner effectively with the World Bank and others to deliver climate action, particularly in areas of conflict-affected countries where there is limited government influence. One myth that we also describe in the report that I didn't touch on here is the idea that if you don't work with governments, you cannot get anything done. Busting this myth and finding a more effective alternative means of engaging in climate action is critical. We need to ensure that finance is directed not just to support central governments, but is also available to NGOs, particularly local ones and women-led organizations. Similar is true of efforts to fight extreme poverty. The World Bank and other multilateral development banks have made incredible progress at the global level in reducing extreme poverty, but we see it rising in conflict-affected states and countries on the watch list. So if they're to achieve their goal of eradicating extreme poverty, that can only be achieved by identifying ways of doing so in conflict-affected states. Working only with central governments is not going to work in those places. So one of the things we call for, and indeed the World Bank has indicated that it's increasingly open to, is that they should diversify their partnerships to ensure that the efforts to fight poverty can work for communities in these conflict-affected areas, and partnering with those local organizations, non-governmental organizations. We also set out specific actions that can be taken to ensure that the obstacles that are holding back women-led organizations can be removed, so that they can access more funding and don't face overly rigid approaches to compliance and eligibility that block them from accessing the money that is available to other organizations. And we think this would be a powerful way to prioritize gender equality in crisis response and to shift power and resources to women-led organizations. Lastly, and as I said, I might touch on this in a bit more detail, we also call for efforts to stem impunity and reinforce international humanitarian law. So to explain why we think this is important, as we look at the crises on the watch list, it is striking that parties to conflict feel free to operate with extreme levels of impunity. Civilians and the infrastructure they depend on are unsafe as international law fails to protect them from the actions of warring parties. International humanitarian law, IHL, obliges warring parties to take steps to mitigate the impacts of conflict on civilians. But violations have become normalized, and in so many of the countries on the watch list, we see attacks on hospitals, schools, homes, denial of access, mass killings with impunity. And this trend seems to be growing, whether that's in Sudan, Gaza, or anywhere else. War without law has long-term impacts. As parties to conflict destroy the health, the food, and other systems that communities rely on, the effects of the war grow and last ever longer. So in wars since the 1990s, for each person killed in the fighting, there have been between 3 and 15 more deaths from starvation, preventable diseases, and other consequences of the conflict. I want to be realistic. What we propose in the report is not going to end conflict, nor is it suddenly going to end all violations of international humanitarian law. But there are 3 reasonably realistic, though still challenging measures that we think would start to shift the dial away from impunity and back towards accountability. So firstly, the international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows that states can act quickly when international law is violated, if they want to. We argue that states interested in safeguarding IHL should establish a new accountability menu, which is inspired by and based off the mechanisms that were brought forward by the UN General Assembly, by the Human Rights Council, and also bilaterally by states in response to Ukraine. So this menu would set out options like having joint investigatory teams to assess whether war crimes have been committed, a commission of inquiry to gather evidence of violations of IHL. And these options, this menu of options, would be available for all crises, not just for Ukraine. Secondly, I don't think any of us are under any illusions about the effectiveness of the UN Security Council at present in achieving its mandate of upholding peace and security. We know that political divisions, and in particular the usage or threatened usage of the veto by one of the 5 permanent members of the council, have left it paralyzed to act in many cases. So we're calling for members of the council to back a proposal from Mexico and France that would mean that the 5 permanent members could not use their vetoes in cases where mass atrocities have occurred. So we think this would be beneficial in 2 ways. First, it would help drive action in the most extreme cases where action is needed, but also start to restore the legitimacy of the Security Council as a body more broadly. Thirdly, we think that establishing a new, what we call an independent access organization, could help to push back on the weaponization and denial of humanitarian access that I was talking about earlier. This organization could play the role of a sort of system educator to help improve reporting on access, which is often confusing and doesn't always focus on what is important, to raise awareness of the impacts of access denial, and ultimately to catalyze action at the national, regional, and global levels. So anyway, this has just been a quick race through the recommendations of the watch list. I do hope it leaves you with a sense of what is possible, not just the immense challenges that we all face. So while the watch list is always a difficult read, and I'm sure this has not been the easiest talk to listen to, I hope it also leaves you with a level of optimism that there are things we can do. If we can bust the myths that have taken a hold of discourse about crises and focus instead on the facts, then there are real solutions that offer real promise to start to reduce the impact of humanitarian crises on affected communities. If we could go to the next slide, please. You should see a QR code. Yes, great. That will enable you to access the watch list report. There's also a web address that you can visit our website to find the report. Please do take a read of the full report, or if you don't have the time to do that, there is also an at-a-glance cut-down version, I think 3 or 4 pages long. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.